Okay, so this is a video game review for Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time for the PlayStation 2. This game was released in 2003, is also playable on Nintendo GameCube, Xbox and PC. The Sands of Time is a 3D action-adventure game which built on the Prince of Persia games, released roughly in the late 70s, early 80s. I was never a fan of the early games. I never had a clue where to go, fell in too many pits of spikes to find it fun. However, this first proper 3D incarnation, there was, I think, one back in the 90s at some point that wasn't quite successful. This first 3D incarnation, the first proper realization of a Prince of Persia game that was successful, wasn't quite the cash-in I expected it to be when I first saw it back in 2003. In fact, while the spirit is still there, everything else was radically overhauled and improved upon. When it comes to revisiting games, there are, generally speaking, three types of games. There are those that retain their value, there are those that are good or better than when you first play them through, and that's very rare. There are, secondly, those that aren't as good. And thirdly, there are those that, usually for technological or control leaps which have taken place since, feel completely unplayable and lose all real value. This game falls into the second category. It saddens me a little bit to say this, as I was expecting to enjoy it as much as I did the first time I played it. However, while I analyse a once treasured game of mine without mercy, let me say that there should still be enough here for someone who's never played this game before. It just happens to be that I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's only been recently playing God of War, a 2005 game, and who was playing The Sands of Time for a second playthrough. So I'm not being deliberately tough on this game, just speaking candidly. The story sees you playing as the son of a powerful ruler whose kingdom has just defeated another nation in a war and are moving into the seat of power in that kingdom at the beginning of the game. The prince, your character, races to acquire any treasures there may be before they are rescued, during which time you're introduced to the main game mechanics in a parallel tutorial. It works quite nicely. Once you make it to the palace, you acquire the Dagger of Time, a treasure which has time-shifting abilities and powers imbued within it. Sometime after, a remnant mysterious spiritualist talks the prince during a congregation of regional kings and lesser nobles into stabbing the Hourglass of Time, another relic found after the defeat of the former kingdom, with the Dagger of Time that he possesses. This releases the Sands of Time, which turns all but a few into what can best be described as sand zombies, with the exception of the Mystic, who looks like he's been modelled on Disney's Aladdin's Jafar, a young woman, Farah, of the former kingdom, who tried without success to warn you of your actions' consequences, is the only other character within the game. The story is pretty vague after this. I wasn't too sure if I was trying to get to the Vizier, that's the game's main bad guy, for revenge or to stop him wreaking any more havoc. As the only identified enemy in the game, there's never going to be any other ending other than these two coming to blows, so really it doesn't matter what the story is, you know that in the end you're going to face off against this villain. So the gameplay is primarily platform and puzzle based, but not puzzles such as use obscure item A with obscure item B, but rather flip the switch, climb the pillar, swing from the attached bar, then run the wall avoiding the spike pits and moving buzzsaw. You'll be moving blocks onto floor switches, jumping from platform to platform, as well as fighting off a few sand creatures during the game as well. The game, however, is platform and light puzzle focused, with only about 25 to 30% of the game dedicated to combat, which is a welcome relief as it's the worst part of the game. It adds length but not really enjoyment, and relies on the repetition of moves which rely on just a few buttons, so you'll just be pretty much pressing square the whole time. And having played God of War only a couple of weeks before, the tedious nature of the combat in the Sands of Time was made all the more apparent. What I particularly like about this game is that not only is the platforming the main ingredient of the gameplay, but it relies on repeated patterns. So as each level goes by, the game's really just testing you to see if you can work out which order you need to work your skills to progress. And that means that progression is usually very steady. The game isn't made up of levels, but more a collection of rooms which exist between each save spot. They're large and expansive, and made to look quite varied throughout, even if the puzzles contained within them are virtually the same as in previous levels. The graphics again didn't show up too well against God of War, which should be said was released roughly 2 years later, but certainly do the job, and the colour palette isn't too bland either, especially in later stages where a good deal of variety is added, and while the graphics seem less defined against, say, something like God of War, they're still pretty to look at, and the sunsets and outdoor areas particularly retain a nice art style through the good use of colour. The palace is quite simply huge, and you'll probably be asking yourself on more than one occasion, how big is this place for every huge hall or room you enter? However, you needn't worry about getting lost, as the game prevents you from going back through the areas you've already traversed, so you're always moving forward. Also, when you enter a new area, you're shown where the exit is. This is an innovation that is greatly implemented. It's a fantastic feature in the game which helps prevent the player getting lost, and I never had any problems working out where I needed to be in Prince of Persia The Sands of Time, which is a big positive and something I can't say about its sequel. The style of the levels seem in keeping with the Persian or Middle Eastern theme, and some are very pleasing on the eye, even if detail wise they do show their age a little bit. Furthermore, the music is suitably Middle Eastern sounding in a more rock groove and fits well enough. The prince is wiry and agile and has a slight edge to his personality, which shows itself more and more as you progress through the game, especially in his dealing with Farah, his female companion, and he's definitely one of my favourite main characters in a computer game. The biggest selling point of this game, other than its use of the Prince of Persia license, is the ability for the prince to reverse time and slow it down also. I remember well the Sands of Time adverts, which pushed this feature heavily, and it did exactly what it claims. However, since 2003, other games have used gameplay mechanics such as these, and while this shouldn't reflect badly on the Sands of Time, 7 years later it doesn't feel quite so innovative, even though it certainly was at the time, and the reversing time mechanic especially is one I still consider to be particularly well implemented. The game is fairly light-hearted, though lonely with so few characters involved in the adventure. It's made up of dozens of fairly short stages between save points, which come frequently. There's no difficulty setting, but it isn't too difficult a game. Most of the challenge will come in the form of the combat, but due to the regular nature of saves and time manipulation powers, any combat that goes awry is easily remedied. The game isn't short-lived either. If anything, it drags just a bit towards the end, when the formula can run a little bit thin. The camera options do the job in the Sands of Time, with a controllable camera assigned to the right analog stick and a pullback camera, as well as a first-person perspective as well, although in combat it can still be a bit of work seeing all the enemies around you. However, some of the buttons, such as the time functions, could have been assigned to different buttons to make the distinction between the two easier, and the block button should not really have been assigned to the already busy R1. It feels like the controls could have been mapped slightly better, but they're not terrible. Little things like the sound effects when you drink the health replenishing water, and the animation which shows that you've killed all the enemies in a given section, are nice touches. Furthermore, there are next to no collectibles in this game, which is appreciated, and the screen layout is clear and unobstructive. So to conclude, like I said at the beginning of this review, The Sands of Time was an innovative platforming game which hasn't aged particularly well, even though I suspect its influence on subsequent modern platforming adventure games is probably greater than we might think looking back on it. Upon first play, I found it to be more enjoyable than when I played God of War recently, and both are well-made games in their different respects. However, the higher production values on God of War, a game which feels very similar in many ways, has not helped my revisit to this game, and it wasn't long before I became tired through the second playthrough. Now let's be clear, this is still a good game. It's just that my circumstances mean that I don't look on it perhaps quite as fondly, unfortunately, as I did once, and believe me, I did really enjoy this game. So I can still easily recommend it. For those who like reliable, quick to get into games, this is it. This is a particularly good game for people who have limited time to play games during their week and just want something to dip into for 20 to 30 minutes here and there. That's ample time to complete a section and save your progress. Just try to avoid playing something like God of War directly before it so it doesn't pale in comparison. This is a generally well-made game which felt innovative and felt fresh back in 2003. Upon a second playthrough, much of this has been lost for me. However, for anyone who hasn't played it through before, I would still heartily recommend Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. Where it was once excellent for me, it's still a decent and quite enjoyable game the second time around. I give Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time a 7.1 out of 10. And that's me.